As quilters, there's usually a little spark of something before we start a quilt, that idea that gets us all excited and anxious, and we can't wait to start our next quilt. Sometimes it's a pattern, sometimes it's fabric, sometimes it's color. Well, this is that for me, and the more the merrier. I'm Lea Louise from Inspired Quilting by Lea Louise, and I am getting ready to make a quarter log cabin. Do you remember these two here behind me? I made those in the last few months, and I absolutely love them. I am enthralled with this pattern, and I'm doing it again. Oh my goodness, it is spectacular. I can't wait to show you. At last count, I was over 100 different fabrics. So I want to show you how to make this quilt, and I want to show you how to really have fun with some color and bring in a ton of fabrics to make it all the more interesting. All right, let's go ahead and get started. It's time to make a log cabin quilt. This is a log cabin pattern that I absolutely love. I've made a couple before, and I'm really excited to do it in these wild red, orange, pink colors, bit of green. You may remember right after the first of the year, I showed a bunch of fabrics that I'd been collecting to make a particular quilt, and I hadn't decided exactly what it was going to be. And I showed you the Moda Fabrics Sincerely Yours as well as Moda Love Notes. And then there was the Anthology Coral Bliss Batiks. So those were the three I already had started with. And when I was putting the fabrics together, I figured I needed about 54 fat quarters to get 2 quilts that I wanted to make. And I had it all together, but then, as it goes, I was buying the background fabric for this quilt. We're going to set it on point, but instead of using blocks and cutting them diagonally, we're going to use just a solid fabric. And that, I think, is going to make it much simpler to do the on-point setting. But you know how it is when you're buying online, and if you spend $5 or $10 more, the shipping is free? Well, of course. There was a beautiful set of art gallery fabrics in a fat quarter collection called Fuchsia, and I absolutely loved it. So one more collection got added to the pile, plus I had a bunch of my Hoffman batiks. I even squeezed in a little bit of K Facet in here. So I have over 100 fabrics in this particular quilt, but it's probably going to end up being 3 quilts. When I cut it out, I primarily am using all 2.5-inch strips, but the other quilt that I'm going to make after is with charm squares. So as I was cutting all my fat quarters, I cut some charm squares. I think I might have gotten a little overzealous, but we've got some charm quilting ahead of us too. But first, let's talk about the log cabin. This is a quarter log cabin, and what we do is we start with a center square, and then we put 3, 4, or 5 rows of fabric. It's up to you. My choice is 5. I love all the fabrics. I love all the colors, and the more interest, the better. So I start with my first square. I got a little carried away and I forgot to stop. So I don't have a square with just the first round, but I did my round this way, and I like in the beginning around this square using different fabrics on each side, because if I just did a single fabric, I don't want the whole thing all the same. I want the layers to look different. Now when I get out to the outer edges and the pieces are longer, that's a different story. I won't mix them up. But what I do in the beginning is I take this piece and I just run it through with my chain stitching. I'll get one long strip of fabric and I'll get my squares and I'll sew them all together. I made a total of 12 of these large blocks that I'm going to show you. And then I cut those apart, turn it to do the second row, and in this case I did use 2 K facets, but that's just because they're so pretty together. And notice this diagonal. Before I even get started sewing, all my strips are joined together in a long length. So I group them by light, medium, and dark, and somewhat by colors, and I wanted to put them together in a method that makes it go quickly and also makes sewing very easy. And I find a diagonal seam does just that. The other thing is that you don't have an abrupt line here. With a log cabin, we're going to have lines, 90-degree angles throughout the block, and I want my fabrics to blend a little more. So by using the diagonal seam, that allows me to create a little softer look. It's a better flowing look between the blocks than just having, you know, straight lines every which way, because that's not what I want in my log cabin. There are places where the lines go, where those seams fall, but other than that, I want diagonal joins. After cutting up lots and lots of strips, then I group them by colors. And they're not exact color matches, but they're particularly a primary colorway. Like this is red, so that's my red group. Then I have, you know, this pink group, and there's a lot. There's solids, there's prints, there's batiks, and predominantly those fall in a pink grouping. So that's how I do this one. This is more about contrast of colors. I wanted to bring green into this, and I also like the coral, and these really go well together. So I'm going to group these. Now the fun part about doing the strips is grouping your colors. You get a good feel for what you have, but then when it comes time to sew them, you can really play with the colors quite a bit. So let me show you. This is probably going to be the best example, because there's quite a contrast in the style of prints. We have some, you know, some geometrics. Here's another just basic plain, but with a geometric stripe. We have a simple print. We have some text. We have batiks and a couple florals. Now, what I like to do is sew some together that are similar so that there's a nice smooth transition. I'm going to make a long strip out of these, and then as I'm sewing them, I'm going to chain stitch this strip to the blocks that I'm building into my log cabin blocks, and I'm just going to run them right after the other. Rather than have a strong contrast, every seam that joins, I sort of want them to transition a little more smoothly. Now, that's for this particular set. I may decide on another group of strips that I really want more contrast in there. So it's about what you want, but these particular colors, I want them to blend. And so what I'm going to do here is I will start with, let's see, I'm going to go with the bold first. That's always a good place to start. Now, most of my strips, I did cut the selvages off as I was cutting them, but there were some that didn't happen. When that's the case, and I'll show you on the next round, I take care of that where I'm doing my seam. But let me show you. The first thing we do is we want to sew these together and on a diagonal, which is a 45-degree seam. And I'm going to line this up here and here. Notice that I allow a little bit of overlay on each one. That way, if they're not exactly straight or, whatever the case may be, it's a fudge factor. It gives me the opportunity to have a nice seam without worrying that when I flip this over, I'm going to come up short. Now, when you work with batiks and prints, it can sometimes get confusing and you forget to turn over your prints because you're so used to seeing the batiks, which are primarily reversible. Most batiks you can use either side and get the same results. So we have this little bit of overlay, and again, that's sort of your safety factor to make sure you don't come up short. The other thing is it also identifies to you exactly where you're going to be sewing. So we want our needle to come right into this point there. And I'm going to drop my needle down, make sure I'm fit in the right place, and then I'm just going to start sewing. And I'm going to eyeball from here to here. We're only looking at just over a couple inches, and visually that's usually relatively easy to do if you've had some experience and practice doing it before. If not, draw a line. and or even just press a line. You can just come in, you know, do this, and then there's your line, and you can sew across that, so that makes it easy. But here's a piece with a selvage. I want to show you how to manage a selvage. And let's see, does this one have a selvage? Nope. So what I do is I allow this selvage piece to overhang where the seam is, and I also allow that little extra. So when I cut this off, that selvage is gone. So again, I'm going to line up right there in the corner and come to the other corner. Now I want to start putting in some greens, and I'm going to go with a green that has a lot of this coral color, and so I'm going to go with this one. Now they're going to blend well together because they both have the coral, they both have the white, and though the greens are different, it's still there, and they're both flowers. So when you're joining them together, and if you want them to blend in a certain manner, think about what aspects you can use in the print to create them to blend, whether it's the color, the print, the motif in there. There's a lot of different options you can look at. Now I'm going to add this strip. Now this does have a selvage, and when I have a selvage piece, I put that to the other end. I sew this second. I do the cut piece first because the piece that I'm adding goes on top. And if I add that selvage on top, it's going to get a little messier, only because there's more for me to, you know, kind of align. This way it just is cleaner. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this one done. We'll go ahead and sew from corner to corner. And then I'm going to go with this print. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go with this print because I want those two peachy coral colors to come together. So I'm going to put this here, and I'm going to bump over from my selvage. Like I said, I have over 100 different fabrics. Many of them that were full fat quarters I did trim first so that I could make sure I had the selvages removed ahead of time. But there were a lot of other pieces that were random here and there, and I just cut them into strips. And knowing that, you know, I can use this method to clean things up at the end. Okay, that's a selvage, and that's kind of wrinkly, so we're definitely putting that to the other end anyways. If you find that your fat quarters are particularly wrinkled or creased, you do want to take care of that ahead of time, because otherwise it can be pretty hard to cut some straight strips that way. And I'm just getting ready for the next round. The other thing that I do, simply because I hate to waste fabrics, is I want to save these pieces. I'm going to sew a line that's about a 1/2 inch in, and then I'm going to cut between that line to create some mini half square triangles. Now, I don't know what I'm going to do with those half square triangles. I do have quite a collection, especially after making this quilt a few times, because I do create a lot of them. One option is to use them in the quilt back. They can also be fun to use as a border. So there's a lot that you can do with them. But I don't want to have to cut them individually and then go back and match them up and sew them. So this just works out really well for me. And it's going to be a fantastic scrap quilt someday. Someday, I don't know when that might be. So now I'm going to come through here, and I only cut on the side of the long strips. I'm going to keep these attached. That way, when the time comes that I'm going to use them, I already have them kind of grouped into colors, And if I want to put them all together in one, say a 9 patch or something like that, then they're pre-grouped, and I can work with them accordingly. It just kind of helps me be organized rather than have, 1,000 of these little pieces flitting around. I have some sort of order to them. Okay, so now I'm going to put my little half square triangles. Look at these. So I'm going to get a half square triangle that will measure, let's see, over 1.5 inches, maybe 1 3/4 inches, not quite 2 inches. But that's a great little block, and alternating it with some solids and or other half square triangles, making little mini stars. I mean, this is a lot of fun right here. So I'm going to have to do a video on these. Oh my goodness, I have so many. That's a great idea. I hadn't thought of that. Okay, putting that aside, let's get back on track. So now I have my strips sewn, and I do not press them at this time. The reason being is sometimes as I'm sewing, I'm going to start from this end, but then when I pick the strip up for something else, because these do get quite long, I don't always use the entire piece as I'm sewing. I may stop in the middle and switch out to something else. And so when I come to the other end, which I know it's here somewhere, then, I have another piece that I can work with from this side. And obviously I would press that before I use it. Let's go ahead and start putting this on a block. Here's the first round plus the beginning of the second round. Now this is the second round with 2 rows around the center, and again, see the diagonals, and they work well if you put them together with similar colors, and that's what I group them as I said, like these would all be white backgrounds. These are going to be by reds. These will be pinks, and so by joining them in one long strip, it makes sewing so much quicker because then I can just do the chain piecing. Now, then we want to get out to our third row, and here we are. So I want to mix light colors with my dark colors. Some of the blocks, like I said, I'm making 12 altogether. Some of the blocks start with a lighter inside and then go dark, and this started dark and then goes white. Now, I do want all my center squares to be similarly colored and the same kind of intensity of color. So they're all either a dark purple or magenta, that dark color. And the reason I'm doing that is because we're going to add 2 more rows once we get here. Here's the block I showed you earlier. It has the center square with the first round of logs and 1 strip. This is the one I got carried away and I couldn't stop. So now I'm going to go ahead and continue. And let's see, I want this batik, and there's a lot of orange in here, and I kind of like that. No, but I think I'm going to go with the other end because that's going to get me into the green. So I'm going to choose this strip that will lead me into the green. Now, one thing I'm noticing on this strip, and it could very well have to do because this was wrinkled up, is that I do not have a full 2.5 inch strip. I'm coming in at 2 3/8. So if I use this with a 1/4 inch seam, my block is going to be skewed. It's going to be off. But look, I come down here and there's my 2.5. So something happened right there, and you can see there's a notch in the fabric. So there was something going on that caused me to go off. Now this I'm just going to put in my scrap pile. It'll definitely get used later, but I don't want to use something like that on this kind of a block where accuracy is important. And that's where practicing your 1/4 inch seam not only allows you to get good straight seams, it also gives you a visual of what to look for, so that when you see something like this, you go, oh, that doesn't quite look like the right dimension. Something doesn't quite look as it should. And, gives you an opportunity to double check and watch what you're doing. Okay, so I lay my piece on top. I always put my strip on top of the block. The block has been pre-sewn together, so it's pretty stable. It's less apt to stretch and be moved around by the presser feet unnecessarily. So I'm going to put this on top. If this were on the bottom, because it's just a loose piece of fabric, it's going to be pulled more quickly by the presser feet underneath here. And that's going to cause this to actually become a larger strip than it should be. And what'll happen is it'll wave a little bit, kind of waffle along, and that's going to give you more fabric than what you need. Have you ever put a border on a quilt and then when you went to press it or to quilt it, you realize there's more border than there is quilt, and you can't quite quilt because there's more fabric getting in the way? Well, that's what this is on a smaller scale. So if you put this strip on top, just like a border, anything else like that, just keep this on the top and you're going to have much more accurate results. And I definitely take a scant 1/4 inch seam. And the reason for that is because this block has so many seams in it. There's 5 rows. So my center piece plus 5, that's a lot of seams. And if I'm taking just the littlest bit more on each seam, my block is shrinking. And it's hard to get uniform size blocks that way as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and I just cut this off. What I do is I turn it over to this side. Whoops, excuse me, bumping the camera. So I put this here and I hold this up with my finger. Alternatively, you can lay it down, but I just want you to be able to see it more clearly. And I cut at least 1/8 of an inch out. And the reason for that is when I turn this over, I keep my seam to the outside, going towards the outside edge. When I turn this over, I want to make sure that I allow enough for it to be straight. Because if I put, whoops, I'm sorry, kind of close quarters here. If I put this right here, then you can see that's a bit narrower. That's a bit narrower, and this is wider. And if I were too close to the edge, I could actually lose part of the seam allowance that I need to get a good straight seam. So these are just little things that I do that I found work well for me. You may have other methods that you use, and that's fine, as long as you get accurate results. Now, this is the part that I love about using the diagonal seam, is I can match this up here, and let me just make sure that seam is finger pressed. I don't want to have any little folds or tucks here. Slight camera adjustment. That last encounter obviously bumped the camera out. My apologies. Now I'm going to line my corners up, my edges up here and here. Sometimes when you do a seam on a diagonal like this, if you don't get it exactly at the 90-degree mark, you're going to get a little bit of a, how do I want to say this? The fabric may want to kind of turn in or out. You know, when you sew a piece of fabric and you pull it, put in a tuck, that it sort of angles this edge. Let me show you like this. So see, that edge is no longer straight. It kind of wants to curl up, and sometimes that can happen. Now I'm going to show you what I do about that. So I'm going to let this overhang up above just a bit, and I'm going to line this up with my outer edge, and I'm going to start right here with my 1/4 inch seam, my scant 1/4 inch seam, and I'm just going to bring this down. Make sure this is lined up. I obviously had a little nick of fabric pull out right there, but I'm going to be okay because I have a seam right there and I have enough seam allowance that's going to hold it. Now, if that were on the edge of a seam, that it would take a lot of, a lot of pressure or pulling of any kind, then I would definitely want to go ahead and switch that out, because then it's going to be more apt to tear or pull apart. Now, the other thing I want to show you is chain stitching, which I think works out really well. I'm just going to go ahead and take another block. This is the one that has 2 rows. Now, always start with this short row. So you have your center block. This is your first, what do I want to say? Your first log, and then you go around, and then the first log of your second round. So always make sure your first logs are in the same position from the center, because that's just going to give your block a much better look, a more uniform look. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to leave about 1/4 inch between my 2 blocks, and I'm going to run this down. Now here's a point that I want to show you. When I cut this off, see how that's a little bit angled? So I put my ruler and I line it up down here, and I line this line right there. Now you can see how my line goes straight up this way, but the fabric goes that way. That's the reason why I leave that 1/4 inch of fabric between my pieces as I'm sewing. That allows for that little bit of variance. And that's going to occur naturally. Anytime you cut without a ruler, you're not going to go perfectly straight. It just doesn't happen. So I lay this nice and straight, and I align this with the edge of my block, because I trim these blocks as I sew to make sure that they're square. So after each round, I sew them up, after each round I press them nicely, and then I trim around the edges just to make sure that they're square and that they're all even. Because getting them even is important for this quilt, because we're going to then cross cut them into 4 pieces each. And then those are the pieces we're going to sew together for our final close. And if our blocks aren't all the same size, it can really wreak havoc in putting your quilt together. Okay, so I'm just going to line this right up here. And lay this here, take it nice and straight. All right. I'm going to cut that one, and I will cut this one. I just want to cut them apart. All right, so let me lay this nice and straight, get down the middle as best I can. And I want to, I'll set this one over here. I want to add the continuation of this green here. When I'm on the outer logs, where they're much longer than they are in the center, I prefer to try and keep some of these pieces connected, so there's more of a visual impact than just having this little corner piece right there. I don't want it to be that scrappy looking. I want lots of colors, and I want it to be intentional, and I want them all to come together nicely. Okay, so I just line that up, and you can see that I manipulate the alignment as I go. So I know this is straight, and this should be relatively straight, but seams can sometimes cause it to go this, that, and the other, which is where the trimming comes in as being quite important. So I'm just going to go ahead through, and all I'm going to do now is continue adding rows around these 2 blocks to finish them, and I'll take them to the 3rd row. So this has 2, and I'm doing the 3rd on this one, because after the 3rd row, see how this kind of went out? And that was just some strange thing that I did when I was cutting. After the 3rd row, we'll put in the accents, and that's a really fun addition, and so that's what I'm going to show you next. So I'll go ahead and finish these up, and then we'll get on to that last step, and then we're just about finished, at least with making the blocks. And let me show you what this looks like. Oh my goodness, I absolutely love this. Let me open it out. I mean, I could make a quilt just out of this. Isn't that gorgeous? What you may notice here on row 4, do you see the difference in size? These are all 2.5. Everything so far in these first 3 rows are 2.5 inches wide. But then I went to 1 3/4. So that'll give me a 1 1/4 inch narrow strip, and then my final row will be a 2.5. I like doing that because it adds a lot of interest. The other thing is this allows me to add an accent strip, and being a different size makes it stand out even more. The color will create the contrast. The size creates more of an accent. And I'm using these dark colors here, and that's the same colorway that I'm using in this strip here. So I have my 3, and you can see there's pinks and orange and green and purple, and there's just all kinds of colors in here. And I just went through and I created all these blocks. Now my next step, there we go. My next step is going to be to add the last 2.5 inch row out here. And yep, there's some more Cape Facet. I found that on sale. Oh my gosh. I have a new quilt store in town. I can't tell you how excited I am. They've been here a while. I didn't know about it, but I found them last week. Oh my, they had Cape Facets on sale for 30% off. Christmas fabrics, 25% off. Yes, so there will be more fabric to show you in the future. I have a whole bag full. Yes, so here we are. And I love how this all goes together. Now, this can be hard to look at as it is in its entirety. But what we're going to do is we're going to come in and break this down into quarters. Then we're going to set them on point. And this is a stunning, stunning design. I am so excited to show you. Look at those sunflowers. Oh my gosh, I think that's one of my favorite. The sunflowers and the peonies. I love them. And you can see I put them in wherever I could find a way. So there's lots of hearts, you know, it's sort of Valentine-ish, but not specific. And notice this dark outer edge, that's going to be the accent strip that's going to set everything apart. So that's what's going to happen next here. I'll put the accent strip on, and then we'll do the final 2.5 inch, and we're good to go. So that's all I need to do is finish up these blocks, and then I'll show you how we're going to cut them. Actually, you know, I do have one cut. Let me show you real quick. I got ahead of myself. I really shouldn't have cut this until I put the final row on it, but I got excited. And I wasn't thinking. I thought, oh look, it's done. I can. No, not quite. But it'll be very easy just to put this last outer layer. But this is what the large block looks like, and we cut it like this. So these are the individual blocks we're going to work with. And just look at these. Oh my goodness, I think they are so wonderful just individually by themselves. And so you can see why I want to put lots of color in here, because each one is going to stand out on its own, and then it has this wonderful little accent border that's going to make it so fun and interesting. And look at that. Oh, and little hearts here, batik hearts. My goodness, you gotta love those. And where I have little corners like this, that's fine. I just sew right along that, and I leave those little bits in there. And that just adds to the interest. I love it. And even some text. Have you seen, I think this book is it Little Women that they've printed on fabric, and they've kind of made a low volume. They do it in a number of different colors. In this quilt, it's in this sort of, what do we call this? I don't even know what to call these neutral colors anymore. It's sort of beigey, but there's also one in a green that's really pretty. So it's just kind of fun. And this is block number 12. I only needed 11, but I went ahead and made an extra and thought, well, you know, I can either make a table runner, a pillow, some kind of a accent piece of some sort to go along with this. Or I can even use them on the backing. Ooh, that would be pretty to have these on the backing. Okay, finger press the seam. My blocks are cut apart and I'm ready to do round 2. And we just keep going in that same clockwise direction. Going to leave a little bit overhanging up on top so I have plenty of adjustments. And I'm just going to sew down. And this will look nice because it's going to come around the corner. And like, look at this. Look how well that transitions. We have these two, those two. I tell you, doing the diagonal is the way to go. And I've been doing that on all kinds of strip piecing that I do. And I think it's just wonderful. It looks great. All right, one down. Let's go to the next one. We have our next one. I'm going to finger press and just tuck it up under here, leaving a good 1/4 inch, maybe even a little more. The farther out I go, I tend to leave a little more space because there's that much more flexibility here that you may need if anything isn't completely square. Okay, so we'll just go ahead down this way. Still keeping that scant seam. And just go all the way through. So this goes really fast. When you first start the blocks, they take a bit of time because their pieces are so much shorter. But that's where the chain piecing comes in. If you have a long strip like this filled with lots of different colors and you chain piece your small center squares along a long strip that has multiple fabrics, oh my goodness, it comes out beautiful. It looks very well planned. Okay, now I just have a little bit here, so I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to separate these two, and then I'm going to trim this one off and come around. And again, I just prefer not to have a little tiny piece in the corner. Now there are situations where I will, like this is a little tiny piece in the corner, but it really blends well with that. And so it doesn't, they have the same backgrounds. So, you know, that works really well. And you're going to find what your personal tastes are, what you prefer over another, and just go with it. And that's part of your style. And that's going to affect how your quilts look. You know, and people will say, oh, I know who did that quilt. I recognize this, that, or the other. And that's kind of fun. All right, I'm just going to go ahead. I'm just going to finish going around all 4 sides of these blocks. And then we have one more row to do, and the blocks are finished. Except for the part where we have to cut them and repiece them. So we're getting really close, let's put it that way. All 12 of my blocks are finished out to the dark accent border. And now what I'm going to do is add the final round of logs. And again, I'm going to start in the same place, position number 1, where the first log goes, and I want to start each row the same way. And I'm going to use, I've divided the 12 blocks into basically 3 primary colorways. This is an orange one. A lot of the colors happen to be orange or peach or coral, whatever these multitudes of colors are. The other group is pink, and then there's a red group. So with this, I have a lot of pinks and corals and batiks and prints, and I thought this would work really good with this. So I wanted to incorporate some low volume, some light background colors, and I'll do that here. Now some of them already have this worked into the middle, but this particular group was dark in the middle, so I thought, well, we'll emphasize a bit of light color around the outer edges. So we'll get started, and this is going to go just exactly like we've done previously. And we just do our 1/4 inch, scant 1/4 inch, you know, whatever you're comfortable with, and just go around. And then what I'm going to do is chain stitch rather than taking each color around the corner. I'm going to just chain stitch them all together. Just want to get down to the first one, the end of this one where I can join another block. And the size of these blocks now exceed the length of a fat quarter strip. So if you cut a 2.5 inch strip from your fat quarters, you're going to need more than one for each edge. I mean, these blocks are well over 20 inches by the time we get to this 5th row. And here's my next one. And I'm just going to lay this over, line it up along the side here so that I know I'm straight, and leave myself a good amount of room there, little wiggle room to trim my blocks out. As I go along, I make sure I finger press each seam so that I get a nice smooth transition across those seams. Now this one's going to be kind of interesting because I have a seam on a seam, and that's fine. What's kind of fun is it almost, depending on how it lies, it almost gives you a, like a crisscross effect of the 4 fabrics coming together. Okay, let me go ahead and finish this round, and from there I'm just going to get everything pressed, and we'll go on to cutting each of these blocks into quarters, and then we'll start the piecing process. Oh, we've come so far. We're getting closer to the end. Our next step is to cut these beautiful blocks into quarters, and we just don't have enough time to do that today, I'm afraid, so that'll be in the next video, and I'll get that done in just a few days. We'll cut these blocks and we'll repiece them, and we're going to make a gorgeous, on-point quarter log cabin quilt. You're going to be so excited, and you'll love the easy on-point method that I'm going to use with a single fabric. Oh, it's so simple. All right, until then, I will see you later. Have a wonderful day, and thank you as always for joining me. It's my pleasure to be here with you.